Hello, everyone. Well, we're going to try something slightly different today. By popular request, I'm going to try and tell a few stories from my life. Happens to be my birthday today, so I'm very ancient at this point. Um, but I was going to try and start from the beginning and say a few things about my life and times, hopefully bringing in a bunch of anecdotes that people will find interesting or fun. I will say I was born in England, so a lot of things about my early life were originally described in British English. I will translate into American English when appropriate. I'll also mention actual names of people, even though sometimes the names aren't that important to these stories. But I think it's interesting for the historical record to mention actual names. People are welcome to ask questions, make comments, and so on. I may cover them as part of the sort of main flow here, or may come back to them at the end. But anyway, so uh, to start at the beginning, well, I was born August 29th, 1959, in London, England. Maybe I should start by describing some of the backstory ancestry, insofar as I know it, uh, that led to the me, so to speak. And I guess one can start with names, like the name Wolfram. Where did that come from? I don't know for sure. The earliest reference to a Wolfram that I've been able to find is a very minor saint from the 7th century AD, a Saint Wolfram who did nothing that exciting. I mean, I think he was in the marketing of Christianity business and converted somebody at some time or something. Don't know the full details. The only thing I will say about Saint Wolfram is a piece of bizarre trivia that I learned a number of years ago, which is there are very few churches of Saint Wolfram scattered around the world, but there's one in Lincolnshire in England, and it's a church of Saint Wolfram, and it happens to be the church that had a school that Isaac Newton went to elementary school at. So I find it fairly amusing that Isaac Newton went to a St. Wolfram school for elementary school. Um, the uh, I would say that Wolfram was spelling wasn't standardized in those days, so it was sometimes spelled with a WU instead of a WO and things like this. You might also wonder how the element tungsten, element 74, got the name Wolfram. Again, I think that was a name in German, I guess. Wolfram, R-A-H-M, means some kind of spit or something like this. And it was a thing that came out when people were mining aluminum. And I don't think they liked it very much. And it got this kind of derogatory wolf name. And that was kind of where the name for tungsten, which has symbol W in the periodic table, it was what I think happened is it was in Europe called wolfram. In the US, it was called tungsten. And I believe sometime in the 1950s, there was kind of a big discussion about how elements should be named. There was another element, niobium, which had the name columbium in the US. And it was sort of a deal that was made that niobium would get the European name, excuse me, and tungsten would get the US name. And so in Europe, it's still the case that sometimes tungsten is referred to as wolfram. I've had very bizarre situations talking to people who don't speak English very well from countries where tungsten is an important mining thing, where they will see my name and they'll particularly see the name of our company, Wolfram Research, and they will be irreducibly confused about how that relates to tungsten. I also get a fair amount of spam from companies selling tungsten and so on. But that's just one of those uh, details of a name. But anyway, so coming to my actual known ancestors, I mean, I guess I know them a few generations back. And where do I start? Well, uh, let's start, I guess, well, everybody has two parents. Uh, my let's start with my father, Hugo Wolfram. Was born in 1925 in Bochum, Germany, and his ancestry, well, his father, named Max Wolfram, was a veterinarian who had a sort of very academic background. He actually got a PhD in 1909, I believe, in Bern, and his PhD thesis is about the thymus gland of the cow. And it has very modern looking kind of electrophysiology pictures from probably from an oscilloscope, I suppose, in it. Um, but for whatever reason, he, after being sort of a very academic start, decided to become essentially a local veterinarian. In in World War One, he was in the German army, and he was responsible for the horses in a cavalry regiment. And it's said that the only shots he fired in the whole war were on a hunting expedition where he narrowly missed his commanding officer trying to shoot at some bird or something. I will say that particularly on my father's side, the family stories don't necessarily have total accuracy to them. I mean, this is what happens. My father wrote novels, among other things, and so was a teller of stories and yarns and so on. And I think some of the family history stories had a definite sense of fictional components to them. But and some of them I've been able to check. Sometimes I've discovered that they were a bit wide of the mark in somewhat amusing ways, actually, in many cases. Um, I will say that for some reason, just in the last couple of years, uh, people have started showing interest in some ancestors of mine, having nothing to do with me. Um, the my both my father's father and my mother's mother, people have completely independently contacted me about various kinds of exhibit things related to them, which is sort of a surprising thing after all these years. Anyway, so about Maxwell from my father's father. Um, he after World War One, he settled in Bochum, Germany, and was people always said of him. I mean, he died shortly after I was born. I certainly met him, but I don't remember doing so. But people said that he was much more into the horses than the people, and he would walk down the street and tip his hat at the horses, but didn't necessarily pay so much attention to the people. I will say also, I know when he was in medical school, in or veterinary school, I don't know whether those were combined in those days. He was told at like age 20 or something, don't expect to live long. You have some heart defect which will kill you in 6 months or something. He actually lived until at least his late 80s. And that turned out to be a bit of misdiagnosis. But in any case, he had um, I guess his other feature was he was quite into things like cars. He had a brother named Paul who went to work at Bugatti, a car manufacturer. And in fact, I just found very recently that in 1926, Paul Wolfram wrote a textbook on the internal combustion engine. Um, that I don't really know what happened with it, but you can find it on the web these days. Well, anyway, so the result of his brother working at this car company, Max Wolfram got himself a very swank motor car, although ended up having some accident with his motor car that led to a gammy leg for the rest of his life. But in any case, then uh, my so that was my father's father. My father's mother came from England. Uh, Her name was Edith Nathan, and her parents had, I think, I think they were leather merchants, and her mother was an Anna Rothschild, who was a descendant of the famous Rothschild family, although I believe in a branch of the family that didn't go for the money but went for other kinds of things. I think her father was maybe her father or her grandfather was a rabbi in Germany, actually, uh, who I think was notable. I think he was based in Aachen. I think he was notable for translating things from Hebrew into presumably German and so on. But anyway, she ended up in England, and uh, so my father's mother, Edith Nathan, was grew up in England. I would say not high society, but definitely in the upper echelons, so to speak. Um, and I think the house that they had, I think I visited when I was a kid, and it was reasonably fancy. Anyway, Edith Nathan ended up meeting Max Wolfram. I actually have no idea how they met. I don't know how the veterinarian from Bochum met Edith. Oh, I should have said that Edith Nathan became a concert pianist in England. I have no idea how the veterinarian from Bochum met the concert pianist in London. I should, but no, but I don't know that. Anyway, so they um, uh, they got married, and then they had a first son named Walter, and then uh, they had my father, and unfortunately, in childbirth, my father's mother contracted an infection and died a few days later. And I think later it was claimed that, in those days, the whole theory of disease was not as well understood. And the person who'd done the delivery, who was a friend of Max Wolfram's, was somehow had there was some infection that was carried there. Anyway, so this led my father many years later, in the dedication of one of his novels. I think it said, to my mother and grandmother, neither of whom I knew, but without whom this this book wouldn't be created, so to speak. But so that was in 1925, and then the my and I think I recently got actually pictures of the street in Bochum where they lived, which was quite fancy, kind of traditional European, buildings, and it's sort of apocryphally told. And again, it's one of those stories. I don't know if it's true, but uh, that during the Second World War, there's more to the story coming up to that, but that Max Wolfram had known that there was some kind of railway line, supply line thing that ran right past that house, and that he told the RAF in England, you should go bomb that area because it's an important supply line for something or other. And the apocryphal story that's told is that the end result is the house was bombed in World War II. Whether it's true, and I certainly haven't found it in any of the kind of papers that I've got, that the Air Force sent oh, thanks for telling us that message. I'm not sure. Anyway, so then, so Germany, 19, and my father born in 1925. So by 1933, things were getting heated in Germany, and my father, given that his mother was English, ended up coming to school in England along with his older brother, and starting at about age 8, was spending much of his time in England. I think going back to Germany during the school vacations. I'm not quite sure about that. Um, the my Max Wolfram, my father's father, I think as I mean, was sort of tagged as Jewish, um, and although was not, I believe, in any practicing way Jewish. But in any case, things were sort of getting hotter there, and but I think he had the point of view that his service in the German army in World War I would kind of keep him away from any trouble, so to speak. This didn't turn out to be the case. In fact, he had a number of brothers and sisters, most of whom came to sticky ends. I know one sister, maybe an older sister, was a school principal, and then there were other brothers and sisters I don't really know so much about, but they all came to sticky ends at the time of the Holocaust in Germany. Although the one who was the car company person, it's not clear what happened to him. He was kind of lost somewhere in the Pyrenees, um, actually, and he somehow his children managed to emigrate to Australia, and in fact, about a decade ago, I was in Australia with three of my children, and we had the address of the son of that of my father's father's brother, son. Boy, that's a complicated cousin relationship. I know Wolfram Alpha is good at untangling these things, but it was kind of we didn't have a phone number. At least we didn't have a correct phone number. And despite my children saying you just can't do this, I decided let's just drive to this person's house and just knock on the door, which we did. And the person was there, and it was kind of striking because the person just looked so similar to my father. It was quite a remarkable thing. Anyway, we were able to have a nice chat about things there. In any case, um, back to the story of my father's father. Um, Somehow, and I didn't know this until very recently, actually. Somehow he wound up in a concentration camp, um, and and was there for many months, maybe even a year. And then somehow the connection to his his uh, wife's family in England, somehow he got fished out of there and ended up coming to England. There was another sort of branch to the whole thing. Gosh, this is so complicated. I guess every family tree is complicated. My uh, father's mother had a sister named Louise, who I knew when I was a kid, and tagged for me as Aunt Louise. And as I knew her, she was kind of this very proper, sort of white-haired sort of lady who would serve the 5-year-old me crest sandwiches and expect me to operate with them in the proper British way. Um, but in any case, she had a son named Teddy Khan, and Teddy Khan was educated in Cambridge, England, and sort of an intellectual fellow who joined the Foreign Office and then was in the Foreign Office in World War II. He also had had polio, so he was in a wheelchair. And later on, he had all kinds of medical issues and died fairly young. But why am I bringing this up? Teddy Khan was a bit older than my father and was somebody that my father kind of connected with in England. I would say, well, there's some other pieces to the story, but anyway, my father went to school in England, went to I would say semi-fancy uh, in British terms public schools, otherwise known as private schools, um, several of them actually. Um, and by the time he was leaving school, it was pretty much the beginning of World War II. And something that I didn't know until quite recently was that he was very keen to volunteer for the Air Force, and he really wanted to fly a Spitfire. And he tried, particularly through Teddy Khan, he tried to sort of say, he tried to sort of sign up for the Air Force, and they wouldn't have him because he was sort of too German connected, so to speak. And I recently found an interesting letter that he wrote to the Air Force, basically making the case for why he was uh, really on the British side, which he certainly was. But in any case, in during the war, he ended up, I think, working primarily at an aircraft parts factory, and not having a very exciting time. He never went to college as such. That would have been, if he had done that, it would have been sort of during the time of World War II, which in the British version of World War II went from 1939 to 1945. And I think my father was always sort of interested in intellectual things and kind of eventually did night classes about this and that. And uh, but he was kind of embedded in sort of the things of World War II. Meanwhile, by the beginning of the war, his father Max had come to England. He didn't. I think in England he sort of decided he's not going to go and become a veterinarian. He was quite old by that point. He was quite old relative to my father's mother, even when they got married. And I think he became kind of a high-end gardener in England, although I'm not quite sure about that. In any case, he so my father then um, started after the end of the war, started working in a company in London. It was a company that was a textile import-export company, started by a chap called Edward Seeger, and it was a company that I think Edward Seeger had been in the Navy in World War II and had visited lots of different places around the world, and post-war decided that he would leverage that knowledge in kind of being somebody who would buy textiles from one place in the world and sell textiles in another place in the world and be the middleman, kind of setting that all up. I have to say that my father, uh, well, eventually took over that company and was running it for like 50 years. And when I was a kid, the one of the main consequences of this kind of import-export process was that I got lots and lots of stamps from all over the world. So I wasn't that into stamp collecting, but I have a pretty good collection of obscure stamps from obscure places. Um, so my father kind of rose through the ranks quite rapidly in this company, and he and another young person there took over the company after a little while. The person who'd started it sold out, and then by the early 60s, my father was running his own company that was sort of a descendant of that textile import-export effort. In the time when my father started in this business and just after World War II, textile import-export was kind of the leading edge tech, do business from one country to another across the world. Of course, it didn't stay very high tech. And by the time he was leaving the business, kind of all manufacturing was done in places like China and so on, and it was about as low tech as industries come. But it's sort of interesting how these things evolve over a lifetime. But I think the my father always used to claim that there were other sort of textile import-export businesses out there, and his wasn't the largest, but he claimed he was the only honest person in the business, which might have been true. Um, he ended up with all sorts of um, I mean, it was never a terribly large company. It probably had, I don't know, 20, 25 employees maybe. Um, and it was, well, when I was a kid, it was always interesting to visit the office, so to speak, because it had all sorts of office machines, like electric typewriters or a telex machine that was a thing for, sending messages around the world type thing. So that was always interesting to see. And of course, it had the necessary kind of cones of yarn that were being sent as samples around the place. So I ended up with a large number of those when I was a kid. I think the my father also ended up occasionally with all sorts of strange things happening in his business. Like I think at one time he had been doing some deal with alpaca selling, I don't know, llama. I don't really know much about textiles. I never really learnt those things, but there was kind of some herd of llamas somewhere in the Andes, I think in Peru, but I'm not sure. And somehow, as a result of some deal that went bad, my father's company ended up owning the herd of llamas. I don't think for very long, but that was the kind of strange thing that would happen. Anyway, so the uh, that kind of takes my father up to more or less the time when I was born. He was running this textile import-export company, and then in addition, was interested in writing novels and wrote a whole bunch of novels, which eventually started getting published, although that wasn't until after I was born. Um, and I think the papers that all of a bunch of his sort of pre-novel novels wound up being collected in a library at Boston University. My father always used to say they would send him an invitation every year to some sort of get together in London for the folks who they'd collected the manuscripts and so on from. He always used to refer to that as his Boston Tea Party. In any case, so that's more or less the story of my father. Uh, my my mother, um, let's see, my mother was born in Berlin actually in 1931, and she, let's see, well, where to start? Her father was a chap called Walter Misch, about whom I know very little because he didn't stay with her mother for very long. Um, but let's see. My my mother's mother uh, was originally Kate Frankel. She came from Innsbruck in Austria, and she came from a kind of rather rugged mountaineering type family. And she had gone, I don't know the whole process of this, but she'd ended up in medical school in Berlin and had ended up working in the lab of a neurologist named Walter Misch. And she was somewhat younger than him. And they eventually got married. My mother was born, then they broke up. Walter Misch, I knew almost nothing about until very recently. I actually sort of looked him up recently, and he was actually quite a well-published and even distinguished neurologist who eventually came to England, also died fairly young in the late 1940s, I think. Um, and But he was sort of out of the picture very early on. My my mother's mother got got involved in the kind of early psychoanalysis world and worked quite a bit with Anna Freud, and was doing that in I guess starting in Germany, and then came to England by probably 1935, and then had to sort of go and requalify as a doctor in England, which she did, I think, in Edinburgh. Um, and she ended up sort of practicing as a child psychoanalyst in England, and then got involved in starting, I guess, so-called child guidance clinics. I don't know what their modern name is really, social services of some kind. I think she's sort of credited as being a person who kind of initiated that idea in England. I think she sort of broke away from the Anna Freud story fairly early on. My mother's mother then, well, remarried a chap called George Friedlander. George Friedlander had been, well, this is where, family law and reality seem to be distorted. I had always thought that he had been an infectious diseases person in Germany, but and then came to England and was a radiologist. But I think he started in radiology in Germany, and I think he ascended quite high in the kind of German hierarchy of such things. Ended up coming to England, becoming a kind of, I would say, a sort of fairly top radiologist. In England, there was sort of a whole row of doctors on the street called Harley Street. I have no idea if that's still how it works, but he was kind of a Harley Street, radiology doctor. And strangely enough, he seemed to go backwards and back and forth to Germany surprisingly long time. And I guess he was also Jewish. The fact that all these people ended up being Jewish is something I have only sort of learnt in recent years because none of them were ever practicing in any way, so to speak. But I kind of learnt that at least in some way because I have the George Friedlander's passport, and he was going back and forth to Germany until at least 1938. Well, I think that was the last date was 1938. But his passport in the way of those days had a big J stamped on it. Anyway, he And I know that somehow he was, getting money out of Germany and things, and sort of taking banknotes and sort of rolling them up and sticking them in tubes of toothpaste and things like this. So there was a certain amount of effort there. In any case, the he and my mother's mother were then based in London, and my mother's mother, Kate Friedandler, ended up, well, writing a bunch of things. She wrote most notably a book called I think it's called The Psychoanalytical Treatment of Juvenile Delinquency. And it's a book that I think is still in print. I think my brother got some royalty from it recently. That must have been written probably in 1940. When was that? 46, maybe, something like that, 47. Um, and family law has it that one of the case studies in the book is my mother when young, but I'm not sure if that's true or which case study it is. But in any case, so my mother was a daughter of a psychoanalyst, which is not necessarily the thing calculated for the best balanced kind of childhood or upbringing and so on. In any case, um, my mother uh, was during the war was sort of farmed out to a farm outside of London, typical sort of thing to do, while my mother's mother was busily working in London. I think sort of even as the bombs were falling type thing. But in any case, then must have been, oh, probably shortly after the war, my mother ended up going to a school in London, North London Collegiate. I think it's a sort of a uh, I think it's sort of a high end. It's one of the high end kind of girls' schools, probably still operating in England, I think. So then uh, my mother went from there to Oxford as an undergraduate. Right around the time she landed in Oxford, her mother got sick and ended up dying quite young. Um, I will say that the sort of the material that I have from my mother's mother includes all kinds of bits and pieces of sort of psychoanalytical history and the history of kind of science interested people in England at that time. I know she was friends with Lionel Penrose, Roger Penrose's father, who was a geneticist. Um, I also have a little piece of film that was of the psychoanalytical conference of probably 1948, perhaps, in London, that has kind of my mother's mother walking out of the Congress along with Margaret Mead, um, another sort of random connection that one would not necessarily have ever guessed. But I know my mother's mother was quite sort of scientifically interested and involved with all sorts of characters along those lines. My mother's stepfather, George Friedlander, is somebody I knew when I was young, a rather kind of precise and very engaged kind of person who was sort of interested in things scientific also, and was I suppose it comes somewhat with the early radiology territory. In any case, by the time, so then my mother, undergraduate in Oxford, doing PPE. This is a sort of standard Oxford course that she later ended up teaching, was philosophy, politics, and economics. Um, and she did rather well, in the way that Oxford and Cambridge are set up. You know, you get a first. I don't know what that's 10% of students or something like that. She got a fine, top first, so to speak. And then uh, somewhere in the middle of all of this, probably around the time when she was finishing college, my uh, okay, how did my parents meet is a question one might ask. Um, and it's a slightly funky story. The uh, I had mentioned a chap called Teddy Khan, who was the son of the sister of my father's mother, and who'd been a Cambridge chap, and so on. He had known in Cambridge, and actually, I think in school before that, a chap called Newell Wallbank, who was, uh, I think, as a matter of fact, the Khan family had somehow paid for Newell Wallbank in some school setting and so on. Anyway, Newell Wallbank uh, was a chap who'd had got off to a very quick start in life. He was a sort of a music whiz, getting his Doctor of Music degree at some very young age and so on, and was sort of into composing music. Well, Newell Wallbank, later in life, he became clergyman, and he ended up very quickly sort of ascending to the point where he was in charge of a church in London called St. Bartholomew's. And he got into that position in his early 20s, and he stayed in the exact same position for the rest of his life until his late 80s. I think he did many celebrity weddings and so on at that church, and I think people had sort of told him he should become a bishop or something, but he never did. So anyway, Newell Wallbank, friend of Teddy Khan, um, had married a woman called Phyllis Wallbank, who went by Sparrow Wallbank, who, who knew my mother's mother, Kate Friedlander. Sparrow Wallbank had been kind of a I would say a do-good kind of social person um, in the World War II type period. She subsequently, well, she knew Sparrow Wallbank. These are shaggy stories. Sparrow Wallbank knew Maria Montessori, and Sparrow Wallbank later on was the person who sort of brought Montessori schools to England. I have to say, I asked Sparrow Wallbank in many later years about Maria Montessori, and Sparrow Wallbank said, the first thing you have to understand about Maria is she didn't even like children. I never liked Sparrow Wallbank. She died recently at the age of 101 or something, and she was not my favorite person. I think perhaps I am react poorly to the kind of the kindergarten teacher type controlling something or other. I don't really know, but in any case, I never had a very positive relationship with her. But in any case, Sparrow Wallbank knew my mother's mother. Newell Wallbank knew Teddy Khan, who knew my father. And uh, at some point, my father was uh, talking to the Wallbanks, Newell and Sparrow Wallbank, and talking about how he'd been reading all this stuff about psychoanalysis and so on. And he'd run across this person called Kate Friedlander. And, did they know this person? And they said, well, no, she's dead now, but we do know her daughter. And so that's how my parents got introduced. And they got married in, I think, 1953, maybe. Um, and then my mother, let's see, by my mother was then started doing a PhD in philosophy. Ironically, in Oxford, uh, PhDs in Oxford terminology are DPhils, doctors of philosophy. But at least in those years, you couldn't do a doctorate in philosophy in Oxford. You ended up doing a doctorate in some other sort of subject that sort of connected to philosophy. So my mother did her doctorate in anthropology, and she worked with a chap called Louis Dumont, who was a student of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was a French. Louis Dumont was also French, but somehow was working in Oxford at least for a while. My mother's PhD thesis was about it was about marriage prohibitions. For some reason, anthropologists seem obsessed with kind of who marries who, how that all works. because I guess it's a thing you can sort of identify across lots of societies. But my mother, unlike many of the people who are running around doing field work in obscure places in the world, my mother did field work only in England by going to read documents in kind of in the House of Lords and places like that, where there are law documents stored and so on. Because her PhD thesis was about the the relationship between kind of who was prohibited from marrying who and how long the period of mourning somebody was supposed to be in after somebody died. I guess she sort of discovered this connection that if you look at the kind of genealogical tree of how far out, if how far out you're not allowed to marry, and then how long you have to there's a sort of critical period if I don't remember what it is, you have to wear black for 3 months or something after person X dies if they're a such and such cousin or something. And that corresponded to the exact sort of distance out that you were not permitted to marry. She became quite an expert on all sorts of things about marriage prohibitions that had changed over the years. Like I think a famous one was the deceased wife's sister. And there was a whole thing, maybe in the 1800s, about could you marry your deceased wife's sister and so on. Anyway, that was what my mother wrote her PhD thesis about. Then subsequently, she, I think, worked at LSE, London School of Economics, doing philosophy for a while. Um, by the time I was born, or very shortly thereafter, she had moved to Oxford and was well, in what in today's world will be called philosophy professor. In those days, it was, I mean, in the British parlance, it will be a philosophy don, tutor in philosophy, and then university lecturers and so on. These days, that's all bundled, I think, into the professor term because that's sort of the American version of that term. Um, she was at first at a college called St. Hilda's, and then subsequently at a college called LMH, Lady Margaret Hall, which was where she spent most of her career. Okay, so then that gets us to me, I suppose. And so I was born in Hammersmith, London. I don't think I even know anything about Hammersmith today. I don't think I've ever even been there, but some hospital there. That was the beginning of me, so to speak. Um, my mother kind of um, uh, in perhaps a apple doesn't fall far from the tree, my mother kept rather careful notes about me as a young child. So the first 2 years of my life, I have really quite complete information about what I ate, what I said, what I did, type thing. I think she lost interest when I got to be about 2 years old. Um, but and maybe this was sort of partly informed by the family history of child psychoanalysis and things like this. I have to say my parents, I would say, were much more theoretical parents than practical parents. I mean, I think they had read the books but had no actual idea, had never actually interacted with children, which was fine by me, but led to many sort of strange things. Like if I would introduce them to some kid I knew in kindergarten, they really had no idea whether to kind of offer to change a diaper or start talking to them about politics type thing. Not that my parents talked about politics, and I realize after the fact, I actually don't really know their political positions uh, ever. I think my mother always used to refer to herself as a floating voter, which was perhaps a convenient uh, kind of device for not talking about politics and so on. In any case, so I kind of arrived on the scene. My parents lived in an apartment in London. And I think my first visual memory, I believe, is of the kitchen in that apartment, though I've never been able to check that. Um, the uh, it's a small world, and the people who uh, were, I guess, maybe renting that apartment to my parents were BBC people whose many years later their son was somebody that I interacted quite a bit with. There's a strange strange small world kind of thing. Anyway, when I was, another thing to say about those times, it is said, although I don't have a memory of it, that when I was a toddler, my favorite place to go hang out was the Science Museum in London. So who knows what that imprinted, so to speak, but I don't have a direct memory of that. I was 2 years old. My parents moved to Oxford. Well, actually, they moved to a house in Oxford, and they also bought what was then a very cheap house in a little village called Kidmore End, which is near Reading. It's about 45 minutes drive from Oxford, and about I don't know what it is these days. It used to be about an hour's drive from London. Probably with traffic, it's vastly more than that, and maybe with better freeways, it's slightly less than that. And kind of their scheme was to, I think at that time, my father was mostly spending week uh, the weekdays in London. My mother was at this house in Oxford, and then they were at this house in Kidmore End at weekends, I think. Um, that was I was sort of quite young in those days and didn't have a complete, don't remember all of that. The house they had in Oxford was a one of those row house type things, which is very vertical, not very horizontal. I think it was on multiple floors. It was backed up to a canal actually, which I guess uh, I guess I was never sufficiently tempted to go and fall in the canal or anything like that. Actually backed up onto a place called Port Meadow, which is a place in Oxford, where I do remember when I was pretty young, there was a train line that ran through it. And I remember seeing what I think was the last steam train that was kind of still in operation there. And uh, that sometime in the early 1960s. Okay, so uh, then I guess my mother used to hire these students to look after me, who were mostly philosophy students, I think. Who knows what effect that had on anything. Um, then, well, when I was, I guess, 3 years old, went to kindergarten at a place called the Crescent School, um, and was a very bright group of kids. I think it was a much brighter group of kids than teachers. The teachers I found rather tiresome in general. I think in those days, and one thing to understand about the British education system is that in England, then as now, I think there's a state religion in the country. This was the consequence of Henry VIII and so on. The Church of England was a thing that was sort of burnt into things in the country, including schools. So it was kind of like there was compulsory religious education and so on, which I think I wasn't a big fan of from very early in life. And there was a teacher in kindergarten, probably when I was maybe 5 years old or something, who was very unhappy with the fact that I was by that point interested in the things of dinosaurs and the origins of the earth and things like this. And I would come in and regale the other kids with these stories, and she was kind of telling Bible stories and so on, and that they didn't seem very compatible. I think that teacher had the curious theory that children's brains were like kind of elastic bands, and that you shouldn't stretch them too far or they might break, which was a kind of a proxy for, don't learn too much kind of outside knowledge, so to speak. Um, I do think I was probably a slightly difficult kindergartner. I mean, I do actually remember one incident where I must have been, I don't know, four or something, and it was one of these things, okay, kids all run around like buses. That actually doesn't make any sense because buses go up and down streets, one would imagine. But anyway, I wasn't going to play and was just standing there, and it's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm a lamppost. Um, I think I mean I remember that I think from its original happening, um, but my mother certainly had told that story subsequently. But anyway, I think the one thing I learnt, by the way, from my mother's notes about sort of words one learns and doesn't is that I was one of those kids who learnt the word yes before the word no, which I don't know, that may be a consequence of, I kind of suspect that's a reflection more of parents than of children. But in any case, I perhaps took that point of view of say yes before no later in life as well. Anyway, so in kindergarten, or nursery school as it's called in British English, um, I uh, well, all sorts of things would happen. I mean, I think um, the I was probably a pretty obstinate child, and I think I finally got taught to read by some Canadian exchange student person. But one of the things that was a little odd was that I had in those days a pretty good eidetic memory. I could look at a thing and then just have an image in my mind of that thing. And so I remember at some point sitting around with a bunch of kids. I probably was 5 or something, I don't know, and reading some book. And I would look at the book, and then I would look at the teacher, and I would read off that page. And it's like the conclusion of that for the teacher was, so this kid doesn't know how to read. This kid just memorized the book, which wasn't actually what was going on. But I have to say, once I finally figured out what was going on and that other kids weren't doing this, I started to lose that ability to memorize things from sight. So it's some peer pressure, I suppose, removed that. I had well, a number of friends in kindergarten. I would say that my parents had always asserted that the name Stephen was a sort of innovatively kind of given name, so to speak. Subsequently realized that the name Stephen, at least at that time in the US, was one of the most common first names. And I think it wasn't that uncommon in England either. But my parents really thought it was innovative. So I was kind of disappointed when I showed up in kindergarten and, kids are referred to by their first names. And there was another Stephen. So it was Stephen W. and a Stephen D. I met Stephen D. again 50 years later, and he'd become a teacher, now retired, I think. But when in my kindergarten class, it was mostly, I would say, kids of academics. And, in subsequent times, as I studied philosophy, I find it very amusing when I run across this name of some philosopher. I would say that that period of time in Oxford was it was the golden age of linguistic philosophy. And so a lot of the sort of famous things done in linguistic philosophy were done in Oxford in the 1950s, 1960s, and so on. And so the people whose kids I knew were many of the philosophers doing those things. And so I'll run across some philosopher name, and the immediate image that I have is some 6-year-old kid who I knew who was the parent of that philosopher, and so on. But in any case, I knew a bunch of kids. I had one friend of mine was a girl called Frances Kerwin, who uh, most notably at age of 5 or something, we were doing some carpentry thing, which I'm sure in modern schools, no 5-year-olds get given, actual nails and hammers and things. But this was one of these, Francis saying to me, you just hold the nail, I know what I'm doing, I'll hammer the nail type thing. And the I don't know, 5, 6-year-old me quickly ends up with a very bruised thumb. And so that was a good learning of just because people say they know what they're doing doesn't necessarily mean you should believe them. Uh, Frances herself ended up becoming a mathematician in Oxford, and sort of has ascended the ranks of such things. And actually, a few years ago, became Dame Frances Cohen, the kind of the what is it? It's the female equivalent of a sir, I guess. Um, so that's uh, um, that was one of my friends in kindergarten. Actually, strangely enough, another friend of mine in kindergarten, a chap called Guy Needham. I learned subsequently that he was the son of a fairly well-known scholar of Chinese history, actually, and anthropology. But anyway, he had an older brother named Tristan Needham, who I knew a bit, and who also ended up becoming a mathematician. Actually, a person who's written a couple of very nice books using our Mathematica software product in much subsequent years. In any case, in kindergarten, oh gosh, I mean, the uh, I think I was a unremarkable but probably rather obstinate child. At the age of 7, I ended up going to a place called the Dragon School, Oh, by the way, another thing, another kindergarten tale of mine, which I actually wrote about at one point, um, was I think I must have been 6 years old or so. Well, in those days, my parents had by then moved to an apartment that was right by this college, LMH, which turned out to be just about, well, one long block away from this kindergarten that I was going to. So in those days, kids age 6 and so on would just walk to school on their own, which I did. And one day I was walking to school and I noticed that, underneath the tree there were these patches of light, and the patches of light looked really weird. They were sort of crescent-shaped patches of light. And so I don't know whether I really knew about, I must have known a bit about eclipses, but I kind of realized, yeah, look at the sun. Yes, it's got a bite taken out of it. So I show up at school and I'm saying to all the other kids, look, the sun has a bite taken out of it. It's an eclipse type thing. And they didn't believe me. And the teachers were like, kids, don't look at the sun. So that was another one of my sort of life learning type things. I recently, it was the kind of 50th anniversary of that date. And of course, one knows when the eclipse happened. So I was able to kind of track down exactly when that happened. But anyway, the um, uh, let's see. Um, uh, well, going forward, I don't know how much further I'll go today, but going forward to the younger me shows up at what in England is called prep school, preparatory school, I guess, a private elementary school. Um, and uh, it sort of started at age 7. Actually, it had a sort of a sub year that was called the baby school that started at age 7, and then the main thing started at age 8. Anyway, so I showed up there, and I guess the notable uh, features of that, I think, and the way things worked at least in those days in British schools, sort of everything was ranked. There was the top stream and the next stream and the next stream and the next stream. When I first showed up there, I was in the stream number 2, and after one term, I got put in stream number 1, and I think I did quite well. And in those days, the 7-year-olds all got kind of ranked in every subject, and I still have some of those school reports. I will say that I was very sort of allergic to the kind of math kinds of things that were being taught in those days. I should say that in kindergarten, um, they were teaching math, and one of the kinds of math they were teaching was how to do arithmetic with British money. And British money in those days was pounds, shillings, pence, 12 pennies in a shilling, 20 shillings in a pound, kind of bizarre mixed radix arithmetic. And it must have been around, I must have been 6 years old or something, because I remember telling this teacher, look, there's no reason money has to work this way. There's no reason that it has to be this weird thing where you do all these strange carryings when you're adding things together. And this teacher was like, it's worked that way for 800 years. It's never going to change. Well, like 6 months later, it got announced that Britain was going to decimalize its currency, which is something that finally happened in 1970. And so that was another sort of interesting moment. I have to say, I think if the British currency hadn't been decimalized by 1970, by the time electronic calculators came in 1972, 1973, I think people would have just gotten used to using calculators to do money calculations, and it probably still wouldn't have been decimalized, just like length and so on never got decimalized. So at least in places like the US. And I guess, at least when I was growing up in England, it wasn't decimal. I don't know to what extent it's been decimalized now. But in any case, the other thing I suppose I might mention about my my kindergarten experience was doing all these arithmetic sheets and things like this. And the one thing I figured out was a piece of automation, which was if you take two rulers and you put them next to each other, they'll make an addition slide rule. And I think these teachers were often very confused. Why did I have two rulers on my desk when we were doing these arithmetic tests and so on? But anyway, it was an early effort in tooling. I think the tooling I built has gotten more sophisticated in the intermediate years, but that was an early effort along those lines. I would say also that in the time I was in, particularly probably in kindergarten and a bit after that, my mother would take me around to all of these, various events that philosophy, you know, events that she was going to. And so I ran into many philosophers. And there's one particularly notable time, I don't know how old I was, maybe six, maybe something like that, I'm not sure, um, where some party where there's a white-haired philosopher, probably younger than I am now, but who knows, um, who perhaps bored with the grown-up philosophers, decided to find the kid in the corner, so to speak. I was the only kid who was there, and starts this long conversation with me. I don't remember about what. The only thing that was notable was this person kind of, after we finished the conversation, kind of wandering away and muttering, one day that child will be a philosopher, but it may take a while. And which perhaps is correct in the end. Um, but it was interesting having the experience of being around a bunch of philosophy people, so to speak, in early life. I would say that uh, the how could you possibly know that question was probably more prominent than or how could one possibly know that was probably more prominent than was for the typical kid. I will say that uh, yeah, um, my mother was by that time she worked a lot on philosophical logic in a very in a um, not in a very formal way. I mean, she actually wrote a textbook on philosophical logic, which I is still in print, and I see it in bookstores and so on. It's a very cut and dried textbook that I think is sort of a very kind of a minimal introduction to philosophical logic. I have to say I've consulted it a few times um, in questions about well, things like the naming of things. Here's an example of an issue. In the days of these philosophers, they would argue a lot about things like, oh, the statement, the King of France is bald. Is that statement true or false? Well, there is no King of France. So what's the truth value of that statement? And that seemed to be a big obsession of the linguistic philosophers in that period of time. That's something that comes up in kind of computational language design, symbolic language, and so on. Questions like that, where there is a thing that is a non-existent, non-referred, a thing that doesn't really refer to a thing in the world, is something that comes up. And I have to say, in some recent projects I've been doing, I've kind of made fairly deep use of some of these kind of issues. I mean, my mother worked a bunch on John Locke, philosopher from the 1600s. She worked a bit on Mill, I think, and she was not, I think, not as into Kant. I don't remember talking to her ever about Kant. Um, but Locke, she wrote quite a bit about, and she wrote quite a bit about the analytic synthetic distinction. That is, statements that are necessarily true versus statements that just happen to be true because of the state of the world. And she would use examples. I mean, I guess I was a kid who was interested in things that kids are typically interested in, dinosaurs, flowers, things like this. And she would often, use those, I think, as examples in her lectures and so on. And I will say about myself at a very young age, I know one of the kind of neat tricks my parents would show off is that I could kind of go around a garden and name every flower in the garden. I'm afraid that's information that I have now forgotten, but I guess I had a decent memory back in those days for things like this. And I tended to have my parents would always describe me as having crazes that I would get deeply interested in some subject for some period of time and then move on to a completely different subject. And I mean, it might be argued that I do projects that wind up as posts that I make these days. It might be argued that I've continued to do that same kind of thing my whole life. Although I have to say, I would give myself credit for the fact that some crazes, projects have lasted, 40 years and counting. So it's not quite that level of episodic work. But in any case, the thing that yeah, I would say that by the time so we're at about the 7-year-old me, and uh, my interaction with things like math, one of the things that happened in my 7-year-old class, so to speak, was kind of a let's learn multiplication tables. Okay, all the kids stand in a line and go down the line and come up with a multiplication fact. And you go down the line, and the first kid to get the multiplication fact right goes to, I guess, goes in front of the kids who got it wrong ahead of them in the line. Well, I quickly realized that I only really needed to memorize one multiplication fact in order to sort of win that game with high probability, which was that 7 times 8 is 56. And so I learnt that at age 7 or something, but I didn't learn any of the other multiplication facts of note, like 6 times 7 or, 8 times 6 or whatever it is. And over the course of my adult life, I have gradually filled in more and more of those pieces of the multiplication table. So I think I can do it all by now, but I didn't learn that early at all. And it's sort of been notable in my kind of life in in doing quite mathy kinds of things, how little I have needed to know my multiplication tables. But I did learn 7 times 8 is 56, and that stood me in good stead in that game. Well, I think I mean I also have I was quite a somehow I developed this. I was quite I have sort of the notebooks that I made when I was 7 years old and so on. I tended to draw these very elaborate diagrams and so on. They got more and more elaborate over time. Another trend that sort of continued. I actually found a school report from when I was 7, I guess, and it has all my places in form, as it was called, which was was I top or second or fifth or whatever. And I think I was in that particular report. I think I had done well in poetry and in writing and in uh, some other things like that. It was my handwriting was claimed to be uh, not very impressive. Now, to be fair, I am left-handed. And in those days, one was writing with an ink pen, and it is kind of tricky to write with an ink pen in English going from left to right and not smudge things. And I guess I don't hold the pen. Some left-handed people kind of twist their hand around. I don't do that, and took me a little bit of. I would give myself I would give myself kind of um, what are they called? Um, not affordance, I forget the name, but for um, um, for the fact that I was writing left-handed, which not so many kids were. But in any case, the thing that I found rather charming, there was sort of a summary at the bottom of the school report from me, age 7. I think I put this report somewhere up on the web. It says something like, he is full of spirit and determination. He should go far, which I thought was a surprisingly uh, perceptive kind of comment from some teacher all those years ago. Anyway, so then uh, in my personal trajectory, uh, age 8, and part in the Dragon School. The Dragon School was in those days this kind of sort of school in Oxford that bunch of academic. There were really two categories of kids who went there. There were the children of academics, and there were the boarding students who were the children of foreign service people. Those were sort of the two main populations, and no doubt a bunch of others as well. But in any case, uh, I am so the way that worked, it's all very British, and it had different blocks. Like the lowest block was E block, and then it went up to A block when you were age 12 or whatever. And in typical sort of British structure, the forms were numbered. So there was so bizarrely ornately complicated. There was a in E block, the top form in E block was called lower 5, and I think it went down to lower 9 or something like this. And then in D block, the top form was called lower 1. So the lowers had been combined together like that. So anyway, I was in lower 5, and the he had a teacher named David Longrig, who was a rather fine teacher. I think his daughter now teaches at that same school. Um, but that was a time when I got interested in spacecraft and space, and it was a time when I guess the first Russian space probes had landed on Venus, and I was really into that. And then there were American spacecraft going to Mars and so on, and I was kind of keeping track of all these spacecraft and getting very excited about them, and writing these little booklets about these spacecraft typed out on a typewriter and so on, with all kinds of increasingly ornate diagrams. I kind of liked using these things. I guess in British English, they're called mapping pens. Not even sure what they're called in American, which is a sign that I haven't used them in adult life, so to speak. But they're kind of pens where they have different thicknesses, and they kind of you typically use them very vertically, and they make very fixed thickness lines and so on. In any case, I was so in school. I think I did particularly well in English actually, and I did probably worst in French, which was another thing one learnt. And I guess at that time I was starting to learn Latin, um, because this was a British school in the 1960s, so that's what one did. Um, I don't remember my math at the time of lower five, but there were a number of kids who were in that uh, class with me. One notable kid was a kid called Hugh Laurie, who I was friends with, and who subsequently went sort of diverged from me in the sense that I was in the top form or whatever in the streams of classes, and he wasn't. And so I really didn't see him that much after that year. He actually went to the same um, public school, the same high school as I did also. But I didn't know him there really. I guess I ran into him a few times, but I didn't really know him there. And I really had kind of lost track of him, but I remembered him from being a kid, aged 8 or something. And then maybe a decade or two ago, I uh, realized that I knew that he'd become a well-known actor, and was starring in this TV show called Doctor House. And I was really amused because I thought, okay, I should see what's happened to Hugh Laurie now. So I switch on this television show, and I remembered that when Hugh Laurie was a kid, he was kind of a slightly age 8. He was sort of a goofy kid, and one feature that he had was he would always walk along the corridor with his head tipped to one side. So I turn on this television show, and what should the character be doing there? At the first moment that I was looking at the show, walking along a corridor with his head tipped to one side. So it's kind of like the that was imprinted on that particular person. I would say early in life. I One of the things I did when I was 8 years old in lower five is I decided we would make a class newspaper called the Lower Five Times, and that was probably my first. I don't know, whether maybe it was my first piece of management experience. I'm not sure. Certainly, I don't remember things that I'd organized in kindergarten, though I might have done. Um, yeah, actually, now that I think about it, I think I did. But in any case, this was the first slightly organized thing where we were typing stuff out and then copying it on a machine. I think it's called a Banda machine. It used this purple, uh, everything came out purple. It was just a way of copying stuff before xerography and those kinds of things. Um, and I got a number of kids. I don't remember whether Hugh Laurie was one of the merry band that was involved with that. One person who was a person called Tim Alden, who I sort of assigned the layout, this, figure out how we're going to organize kind of the layout of this thing. And I was extremely amused many years later to run across that same person, probably nearly 50 years after that time, and he had become the art director of a large group of magazines. So I don't know which was cause, which was effect, but it was sort of an interesting career development from what I saw early on. And I suppose anyway, that was my first kind of effort of organizing kids. I had a number of friends in those days who ended up doing, well, it's sort of always sort of interesting to see what happens with people who you know from a long time ago. And I think sometimes what happens is unsurprising, at least in retrospect, in the sense that I think people, by the time people end up not really changing, their circumstances change. And, I know people who knew me when I was 8 years old and things seem largely unsurprised by the kinds of things I've ended up doing. Although some of them, myself included, actually, the only part that was perhaps surprising is the fact that I got involved in companies and that kind of entrepreneurism. Although looking back, it really was not terribly surprising. Um, the uh, yeah, well, let's see. I can maybe I should um, stop my stories at the 8-year-old me and interested in spacecraft and sort of doing best at school writing and having a certain group of friends who um, were to whom many other things would happen. So maybe I should stop uh, my story here, and I see a number of questions and comments. Um, and okay, I'll answer a few of these. Um, the question: did you travel a lot in your life? Well, I've episodically traveled a lot and very little. When I was a kid, my parents. Oh, I should explain that I have a brother, Conrad, who's 10 and a half years younger than me. So he hasn't yet, in this narrative, he hasn't yet showed up. The 8-year-old me was an only child, um, an only child of parents who, as I say, knew more theoretically about children than in practice about children. And as um, my parents would go on these trips during the sort of school vacations. I went to a bunch of places, particularly in the Mediterranean. Particularly, I went to Malta a number of times, particularly an island called Comino, which is off the coast of Malta. And then one time we went to Sicily. One time that must have been 1966 actually, and I found I was always kept these kind of would write these little booklets about things that had gone on there. And that was a time when Mount Etna, when we were there, Mount Etna was just started erupting or doing more eruption than it had been doing before. So I think that's that's a readily datable thing. I also found from that trip actually in Sicily, yeah, it was 1966 because I wrote the date in the sort of description that I wrote of it. There's a had a film camera and I took a bunch of pictures. For some reason, I was in all my early life sort of allergic to having pictures that had people in them. So there were rather few pictures with me in them. And I didn't take pictures with people in them usually. And they were usually just pictures of scenery, so to speak. But in any case, in using up the roll of film that I used for this trip to Sicily, when I got back, I'm like, I've got to use the last few pictures in this roll of film. And so I ended up taking a selfie by holding, the film camera out at arm's length and I guess getting the focus figured out correctly. And I found the selfie recently. I posted it on the web. I think it's really amusing because it's kind of the expression of concentration of trying to, yes, am I getting this camera? Is it in focus? Am I holding it straight? And so on is rather charming. And it is charming, particularly to me, because I have a particular thing I do with my lip when I'm concentrating hard. And I'm doing exactly that in this selfie from 1966 from when I was 6 years old. Um, but my my parents, another time we went to Cyprus and actually we ended up in a place called Salamis, which is I think on the uh, eastern coast of Cyprus. And it's a city that was destroyed in an earthquake in like the fourth century BC or something. But the the kind of it was it was a place where you would walk on the beach and you would be crunching pottery that had been there since that time. And there were a number of kind of open archaeological digs in those days there. And I sort of kind of found it really fun to kind of dig through. You had layers of dirt, and there was just full of pot shards. Just, the whole thing was thick with pot shards. And so I kind of pulled out some little pieces. I think my father pulled out a complete oil lamp. I pulled out a number of curious little pieces, um, including some with interesting painting, pictures on them. And I still have these today, and it's kind of cool. And in those days, there wasn't the same kind of sensitivity about, taking that little tiny piece of pot shard from wherever it was. But it's kind of nice to have those things. I will mention another thing. Uh, when we visited Sicily, actually, there was some beach with some supposedly ancient river that was going in some direction, which was a very small river by that time, which the uh, the I don't know what it was, 6-year-old me was really intent on spending the whole afternoon digging a trench to try and divert the course of this ancient river. But two things that I found that day. One was a bone, a leg bone of something, which I guess my uh, step grandfather identified as that's a sheep bone. That's subsequently, when it was back in England, I still have that bone. It would have been kind of rather macabre if it had been a human bone, but it wasn't. It was a sheep bone. But I also found this little thing, this little reddish thing, sandstone-ish thing that was sort of had an indent at the top. It's about, oh, I don't know, a couple of inches across. And to this day, I do not know whether that thing is an artifact or a natural object. Back in those days, when I got back to England, that must have been, I guess, 1966 or so, took it around to a natural history museum in Oxford. They said, it's not a natural object. It's some artifact, some seal or something like this. Took it to the kind of archaeological museum. They're like, no, it must be a natural object. Doesn't look like anything artificial. So I still don't know to this day what it is. I've been meaning to kind of do some kind of chemical testing on it to try and figure out something about what it is. But yeah, so that was a small amount of traveling. I think in those days, the uh, the thing that I mean, it was kind of the kind of early plane travel where people dressed up to go on the plane type thing. And I have a few pictures actually of that, just line of people, going on to, I think it was a Comet aircraft, a jet, going to somewhere. Um, and that was the yes. So the answer is I traveled a bit when I was a kid. Then in later life, I traveled a lot around 1980, and when I was playing young physicist, and then I stopped traveling so much. I traveled a bunch in the late 80s when our company was getting started. Then in the 90s, when I was working on new kind of science, I didn't travel at all. Then I really didn't travel at all for a long time. Then in the around 2010 or so, my kids got me to do a certain amount more traveling, and I had a burst of travel during that time. Since then, I've again reverted to not traveling very much. And in modern times, I mean, I was very early to video conferencing and things, and so it was a non-traveling kind of thing. Um, okay, someone's asking on the early history front, any personal recollections with Russell um, and British philosophers, logicians, and so on. Well, Bertrand Russell, my father ran into Bertrand Russell one day. He was staying with a woman called Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a person my mother knew quite well, um, who was a philosopher in Oxford. And my father is not the most reliable teller of stories, but I think this was a correct story. He was, for some reason, he was over at Elizabeth Anscombe's house, and the great man was staying there. And uh, the only sort of exchange with my father was, "Excuse me, do you know where the milk is?" So that was the extent of my parental interaction with those folks. I mean, my mother was never a fan of Wittgenstein, and I think there was a certain Oxford-Cambridge rivalry, but I think she was also uh, is like, this is all very obscure and doesn't help anything, and where's the clear description of what's going on type thing. She's also not a fan of Saul Kripke, a more recent philosopher, who I remember her complaining that, well, so in the tradition of philosophers, right, when you read a paper to a group, you really do read the paper. You write the thing out word for word and you read it. And she was very critical of the fact that Kripke had come to give some lectures or something, and he was just doing it off the cuff. I, of course, always do these things off the cuff, but uh, and I think in retrospect, she's probably right that the tightness of the argument you can really only get if you've written the whole thing down. I mean, I have to say, when I was a kid interacting with philosophy, I would always make the statement obnoxiously as a kid, any subject where people are still arguing about the same kinds of things they were arguing about 2,000 years ago isn't a subject that's making progress. I'm not interested in that. I'm going to do science, which is a subject that makes progress. At least that was my theory back in those days. Um, I think, by the way, in terms of philosophers, well, my mother worked a bunch with a philosopher called Peter Strawson, who was a fairly well-known linguistic philosopher. People, she certainly knew Freddie Eyre, and who was another linguistic philosopher, and what's her name? Person who was responsible for, the name has suddenly slipped my mind. The person who was responsible for the trolley problem was also somebody my mother knew quite well, a woman philosopher in Oxford. Oh boy. Oh, I can't remember her name. In any case, I knew, as I say, the kids of many philosophers. So, for example, Michael Dummett was a philosopher of mathematics, actually, who wrote wrote about Frege, for instance. I knew his kids. I met him, I probably met him once or twice. He kind of lived right down the street. Well, he lived right next to where school was. I mean, there were, let's see, other philosophers of the time. I mean, there are other ones who actually, my friend Frances Cohen, her father, I think maybe still alive, was a philosopher. And there was a chap called Quinton, whose father was a philosopher. I mean, it was thick with philosophers. Oh yes, I'm being reminded here that Philippa Foot was the person who, there was a friend of my mother's who invented the trolley problem. Um, and in those days, sort of PPE, which was the sort of, my mother taught the philosophy component of PPE, and that was sort of the kind of, I would say, the probably the well, there were maybe there was one other sort of big sort of subject in Oxford. It was called Greats, which was a combination of classics and philosophy, which I guess my mother also taught philosophy for. But PPE was kind of the modern thing that the sort of the generally educated folk would do. Lots of people read PPE in Oxford and went off and became, government figures. Many prime ministers and so on had done PPE in Oxford, and my mother taught a bunch of people who would later become quite well-known folk of various kinds. The I think let's see, other philosophers from those days. I mean, there were lesser known ones who my were friends of my mother's. Oh, there's one. Yeah, my mother worked with a person, was an economist actually, named Margaret Paul, who was the sister of a chap called Frank Ramsey, who died very young, died in the 1920s. Frank Ramsey was one of the sort of early mathematical logic, foundations of mathematics people. He invented Ramsey theory and things like this. I didn't really know that connection until much more recent times. Oh, another set of philosophers, William and Martha Neal, were philosophers who most notably, it was a husband and wife team. They most notably wrote this kind of definitive book on the history of logic. They were actually the downstairs neighbors in this apartment that my parents had in Oxford in the 1960s. And I think their daughter became a philosopher as well. But in any case, that was another, the I many years later, I was, had a copy of the Neil's book on the history of logic, and I kind of haven't identified that they were sort of the downstairs neighbors type thing. I think subsequently, um, yeah, um, trying to remember other philosophers. I'm blanking on the oh yeah, another person who my mother worked with quite a bit was a cousin called Gabriella Taylor, who I think is still alive, who they wrote. I was always amused when I was a kid. They wrote some papers together about the virtues. I'm not sure that my mother was the world's most virtuous person. Not shockingly so, but I, for the 8-year-old me or something, it was fairly amusing to have one's mother write kind of academic papers about the virtues, so to speak. I also would always accuse her of being sort of one of the less logical people I knew, even though her subject was philosophical logic. But that's, I mean, subsequently, she actually late in her life, she wrote a book about anthropology also. Um, and uh, uh, yeah, let's see. Um, Someone asks, did you follow your mother's habit of keeping careful notes on your kids? Somewhat. Not, I was not as diligent as perhaps she was. My wife also, I had sort of said, I'm going to record everything. And she's like, no, don't do that. That's a bad idea. So I didn't. But we have quite a lot of records. Um, Someone's noting that it's amazing. I know the trajectory of a fellow nursery school child. I know what happened to most of the people I was in nursery school. Certainly, most of the people I knew at age 7, I know what happened to them all, and uh, I've been in touch with many of them, and I think sometimes they reappear 50 years later, um, and um, it's always interesting to see what happens, so to speak. Um, there's another person who was actually in my kindergarten, elementary school, and high school, who uh, has had a rather mottled life, but became an industrial chemist and was particularly notable for having been in some trapped in some cave somewhere as a cave explorer, and a dramatic rescue type thing was mounted. But I haven't been in touch with that particular individual. I just know that from other people. Let's see. I'm asking, who or what would you credit as being formative in your lifelong proclivity towards science and math and for sort of bedrock understanding? I think implicitly the whole bedrock understanding thing probably comes from the philosophy mother. Um, I would say that my uh, my interest in math and science was a kind of anti-parent thing more than anything else, probably. It was like, my parents don't know about this stuff. This is what I'm going to learn about. And I'm young and the future is ahead of me. And I'm interested in the future. And let me learn about the future. And the future is things like science. I mean, I remember probably when I was just learning to read, I remember there was a store in Oxford, I remember where it was, that had a sort of upstairs area that I guess was children's books. Um, and I remember kind of sitting there looking at the science books because they had, pictures and they had words next to the pictures. And so I was sort of mostly looking at the pictures and vaguely looking at the words. I mean, I always find it amusing that there were sort of predictions of the future back in those days. And I remember one book, which I don't think I still have, or maybe I never bought that book, which had this picture of teaching machines, which were kind of things that looked a bit like old-fashioned cash registers. And there were sort of kids in front of the teaching machines. And of course, nobody ever managed to make that work. Although now we happen to be in the late stages of developing sort of a AI plus computation-based effort in that direction. So maybe finally, 60 something years after that time, after the books about the future from 1965 or something was saying teaching machines are right around the corner, maybe we'll finally have that. The let's see, in terms of sort of what reinforced perhaps, I don't know. I was always interested in science kinds of things. I don't think in school I never had great interaction with those things. I never, I didn't really have great math teachers. I had some when I was in high school that were a little more interesting. I can tell those stories another time. But in uh, I really I had a couple of friends. I shout out to them, Ben Bowen and Hugh Series, who were um, who were kind of science kids who I knew from age 7 or 8. Um, and the Ben Bowen became a plant biologist, and uh, and then did some startups in Silicon Valley in the plant genetics area. And Hugh Series um, uh, rather with whom I think if I do any chemistry experiments using automated labs in the future, the last time I think I ever really tried to do a chemistry experiment uh, was with Hugh Series at age, I don't know, 10 or something, where I learnt that carbon tetrachloride dissolves plastic, um, which was a somewhat awkward thing in the circumstances. Hugh Series' father was actually a atomic physicist, I think, at Reading University. Um, but Hugh Series, many, many years later, became a gerontologist, which was something that I wouldn't have expected necessarily from the from the early version of him, but he was always interested in science. And as I say, we did these chemistry experiments. Ben Bowen was always interested in fungi from a very early age. And I was a little disappointed. I saw him recently that he's still a bit interested in fungi, but he hasn't been kind of fungi all the way down, so to speak. I was actually introduced him to a Silicon Valley company that's trying to discover drugs from fungi, just partly for old time's sake, so to speak. Um, Someone's commenting that as a kid they knew all the dinosaurs at the time. Yeah, right. It's a terrible thing that you would think the dinosaurs have been gone for 65 million years. They would just be you could learn the Stegosaurus, the Brontosaurus, the Diplodocus, the Dimetrodon, all these other kinds of names. You would think you would learn those once as a kid, and they will be the names forevermore. But that isn't true. Paleontology advances, and and now half of those dinosaurs were said to be, oh, somebody stuck the bones from one dinosaur and another together in a museum, and that's not even a dinosaur. So I'm totally out of date with my dinosaurs. I think I also remember I must have been probably when I was 8 or so, learning the organelles in a cell and being in recent times particularly struck by the fact that I had memorized and I still remembered the Golgi apparatus is an organelle of unknown function. That was the thing that I'd memorized at age 8 or something, and of course its function is now well known. Um, but that's sort of progress in things. I think uh, it's yeah. Let's see. All right, I think that was everything. So well, um, uh, thank you for being with me for this for my little birthday launch of my effort to tell some stories from my life. Um, I don't know if they'll get, I hope they'll get more engaged with modern times as I go forward. And uh, I'll next time I better be able to get through becoming from 8 years old to adult, although a bunch of things happened during that period of time. But I look forward to telling you about those things. Um, I I it's a funny thing, kind of disgorging one's stories like this. I've not, many of these stories and anecdotes I've kind of told in fragments at one time or another. I've never tried to put all these things together before, and uh, it's kind of interesting to do that. And eventually, perhaps as somebody who's written a certain amount about my own kind of arc of intellectual development, it is always interesting to realize that things that I that there are sort of things that I later kind of was very involved with, which I hadn't known that I had thought about when I was much younger. Like, for example, I was studied mollusk shells and pigmentation patterns on mollusk shells, and I recently found that I must have gotten some mollusk shells at the age of 7 or 8 that I have to say I hadn't really paid attention to. And then, well, maybe I did pay attention to them at that time. And then much, 20 years later, I was really involved with those things, trying to study them and thinking about biological morphogenesis. But so one of the things that perhaps one gets from the effort to put together sort of the arc of one's history is understanding a bit more about kind of intellectual development. And why is that interesting? I find that interesting partly because to sort of, if one is trying to make further progress in intellectual development, knowing how one puts things together to make the next step in intellectual development is to me rather interesting. And to realize things which I'd sort of had an intuitive sense of, but never really put together in a way that I could verbalize, that's sometimes quite useful. So anyway, well, thanks for joining me. I think we were going to try episode 2 next Wednesday. So hope to chat with you all then. Bye for now.